The first way to hem invisibly is to stitch like you would for felling, with small diagonal stitches that pass through the front of the fabric but just barely, and then through both layers of a folded hem. I'm starting off by creasing my fabric along the grain. And then folding it over again so that the raw edge of the fabric is encased inside. This means that it's much less likely to fray or fall apart over time, and is part of why this is such a strong and sturdy way to hem. I'm starting off my stitching by tying a tiny knot and pulling the needle through the inside of the hem so that the knot is hidden. The stitches that are going to show on the good side of the fabric only go through one thread of the warp or weft. So I'm sticking my needle through a single thread of the fabric and then through both sides of the hemmed part of the fabric, if that makes sense. So needle goes through one thread of the front of the fabric and then through both folded ends. And I'm holding my needle at a diagonal while doing this. And getting tangled in thread, it looks like. So you can see on the good side of the fabric, the stitches are just tiny pinpricks, and if they were made of the same colored thread as the fabric, they'd be basically invisible. A felling stitch can also be done with larger, more visible stitches on the front. It doesn't have to actually just pass through one thread of the fabric, but if you want it to be invisible, it should. If your fabric is much finer and more delicate, you may want to make your stitches go through 2 or 3 threads of the fabric instead. As I said, I folded my fabric along the grain so that the hem is along the grain. And as I'm stitching, I'm trying my best to also follow the weave of the fabric so that my stitches are along the grain. So I'm following one single thread of the woven fabric as I'm stitching. finish it off, I'm tying a small knot. And I'm tying the knot so that it doesn't show up on the good side of the fabric. Apologies for being slightly off screen there. And then I'm sticking the needle through the hem so that it doesn't go through the good side. And pulling it out about an inch away from where I tied the knot. Pulling it a little tight. And then cutting the thread close to the fabric, just so that there's a little tail encased inside the hem, making it slightly stronger. So this hem is nearly invisible. Up close, all you can see are tiny pinpricks. And on the back are just little tiny diagonal stitches. Catch stitching is a second way to create an invisible hem. It's a little more labor intensive. I find it a lot harder on my hands. It is very attractive, and it also helps the hem lie very flat. And it involves creating a series of X's in the fabric. Like with the first hem, I'm creasing and then folding the fabric to create a hemmed edge along the grain where the raw edges are encased. Again, I tied a very tiny knot in the thread, and I'm cutting the thread very close to that knot, and then pulling it through the folded edge of the hem so that the knot is invisible. I start with a tiny back stitch that's going through one thread of the fabric. And then I make a larger back stitch on the top of the hem. And this stitch is not going all the way through the fabric. It's not going to the front of the fabric. And then another tiny back stitch on top of, through one thread of the fabric. And another longer back stitch on the hem. The tiny back stitches should be lying just a tiny bit to the side of the previous longer back stitch you took. And the back stitches, the longer back stitches, should not quite touch one another, but should be close to one another. I find as I'm doing this stitch, my hand gets exhausted and often starts shaking. I find I have to hold the fabric very hard in order to make this stitch how I want to. And I am stitching very firmly. These stitches are pulled tight. But it is a very nice looking hem. And then I'm just tying a small knot at the end and stitching it over a few times for stability. And then, like with the other hem, I'm just pulling the tail of the thread through so that it's encased inside the hem and cutting it off. So there you have a catch stitch. As you can see, it's just a bunch of very small pinpricks on the front of the fabric that if they were in the same fabric, the same color as the fabric, would be practically invisible. I've tried very hard to keep the stitches going along the grain of the fabric, which it lies flat. It's very nice looking.